I wanted to talk about this DSA post because this kind of got under my skin a little bit, and I already made a post about it on Twitter, but I wanted to talk about it again on the show. DSA has put out an infographic, actually a series of infographics about the package that the Biden administration is proposing, which is made of $106 billion, which is, I think, $61.5 billion in military aid and aid to Ukraine, $14 billion in military aid and assistance to Israel. We've got $13 billion for the border, and I think it's like another $15 billion or like something 15 to 20 billion around the issue of like Taiwan and building up forces in Asia. It just specifically only says here like $4 billion for stoking flames with China. It's kind of, I mean, they're morally loading in the words here to kind of like obfuscate what it is. But anyway, I wanted to talk about these series of posts because I can understand, and I've seen other progressives like Socialism Done Left and others who are members of DSA, who are members of what they would call the socialist movement or the progressive movement, or even the social democratic movement, whatever you want to call it, who are saying that they don't like this package, not because of the aid to Ukraine, but they don't like all these issues being tied together like this. They don't want to have to, in order to send aid to Ukraine, have to also send money to border issues, specifically building the wall or investing more into the border. There are people who are saying, look, I don't want this to be tied to arming Israel. I believe that Ukraine has a right to fight against its occupation. I don't believe that American taxpayer dollars should be going to artillery shells that Netanyahu's government is going to use in Gaza and possibly on the border with Lebanon, with no plan in place for how this war, what they're going to do, like what even the goal necessarily is. You push out the Hamas from Gaza, then what? Not to mention how they've been very, I would say, obtuse when abiding to international law and have been openly obtuse around it. I don't know if you saw the recent post from the Israeli government trying to ratio the UN calling for people to abide by international law. Where is it? Here it is. Even war has rules from the UN. Even Israelis deserve to live. What? Point is, though, there are real reasons to object to this package all being together. Because what Biden is doing is seceding to certain moderate, quote unquote, moderate Republican demands, which is, look, you know, a lot of our party is souring on aid to Ukraine. And is souring to, passing anything with you guys. So we'll only do it if you add Israel aid and you add money for the border. That was the Republican pitch. Now, I think that Joe Biden was probably going to give the money to Israel anyway as a separate bill. But Joe Biden's thought is, well, let's put it all together. So the Republicans that are against aid to Ukraine, or somebody who might be against one of the individual aspects of this bill, it'll be much harder for them to object to it. Because if they want aid to Israel as fast as possible, it's going to be pretty difficult to get it to them. If you vote down the legislation sending aid to all of our other foreign allies like the United States or Taiwan.
C. Webster74 has donated $5. Give the Holy Land to theme park developers and make the world's biggest and holiest amusement park destination.
Thank you for the $5. And that is certainly an interesting idea. Point is, though, there is a legitimate reason to object to this. But they are objecting to every single aspect of this. Over $60 billion for the war in Ukraine. Over $114 billion for arming Israel. So these are all the aspects that they're angry about and want to use the money to do something else. That is the premise of this thread. And you can see it here. We could wipe out debt for millions with $160 billion. $20K for 5 million Americans. We could build 1 million new units of public housing, make 133,000 electric buses, or it could power millions of homes with solar energy. Why is the money going to war and a wall? We demand no money for massacres.
A curd is a curd.
Aris385 has donated $5. Sank from TYT said yesterday that the aid would never reach Ukraine and just go to U.S. arms manufacturers.
Well, Cenk is fucking stupid. I mean, at least on this issue, he's unbelievably stupid. And if that is his position, which I will go check, if you have a link, if that is what Shank said, that's fucking stupid. It is true that the money is being, a lot of the money, 60% of it, is being spent within the United States in order to produce the weapons that are sent over. But that aid still reaches Ukraine. It's just that money also helps the arms industry in the United States because you're buying their products. But it does reach Ukraine. It reached them in the form of the finished product. If I said I was going to spend $100,000 to buy grain from an American farmer and then ship it over to Gaza, it would be stupid if someone came up to me and said, "Oh, you didn't actually spend money to send anything to Gaza. You actually just spent the money here." Yeah, I spent the money here on products that are then sent to Gaza. The aid is still sent to Ukraine. The thing is, in Ukraine, there is not a large arms industry that can make up for the deficit that they have in artillery shells. In order to meet Ukraine's needs for artillery output, they need American industrial factories for shells that operate in Pennsylvania. And so if you're going to fund these shells to be sent over to Ukraine, that means funding operations in the United States and investing in these factories to produce these shells, which are then sent over to Ukraine. So the aid still reaches Ukraine, but the stuff is made here to be sent to Ukraine. But no, that logic doesn't make sense. If anybody has a link to Cenk Uygur saying that, send it to me, please, because that is, I mean, that would be terribly ignorant. But I want to say a few things here. Number one, a false dilemma is being created to some extent. And I see this false dilemma popping up its ugly head in so many different left-wing circles. The false dilemma is you either support Ukraine or you support wiping out student debt. You either support Ukraine or you support making electric buses. You either support Ukraine or you support investments into infrastructure.
Burns is an immoral,
morally corrupt, bankrupt man. Whether or not that aid to Ukraine is sent, that's not going to affect the Supreme Court decision on student debt cancellation. Whether or not the aid to Ukraine is sent, that is not going to affect whether more homeless people are housed. These are two issues that you can deal with separately. You can both support aid to Ukraine and support investments into public housing and support bringing back the child tax credit. Not Ease Diamond. Thank you so much for the prime. For example, let's say that right now we added all military aid to Ukraine and we said we're going to take that money, we're going to put it into the child tax credit. Well, you go back to the House, you try to pass the child tax credit, and first off, you can't take the cluster bombs and the old Vietnam era troop carriers, and you can't just make that in the housing. So it's a lot of this stuff is not transferable. But for the stuff that is transferable, the money that we're going to put into new production, you try to take that and put it into public housing, try to put it into a child tax credit, try to put it into any of these issues. You take it to the House floor, Republicans shoot it down. Doesn't happen. That's why we don't have the child tax credit. Every single Democrat voted in favor of the child tax credit. Every single Republican voted against it. I mean, it's tax reform that helps working class people, but that was the problem. That was the problem. As we're trying to put more money in the pocket of the middleman. And what I mean by that is end the tax credits for working people and expand the tax credits for the very rich and wealthy corporations. Putting that aside, putting my critiques of the Republican Party to the side. I'm not talking to them. I'm talking to socialists right now. We don't pass the legislation, and Ukraine doesn't have military aid, and that means more of their cities possibly get conquered, more mass graves get spread out throughout the land, and ethnic cleansing continues. So nothing changes. Nothing changes. So why attack the aid to Ukraine in this way when you could say, yes, we can support Ukraine and we can support American working class people at the same time? The critique from leftists towards this bill should not be that aid is going to Ukraine. It should be that all of this is bundled together when it shouldn't be. That would be the critique from, I think, the socialist perspective or the left-wing perspective that makes sense in my mind. Okay, so the first thing is, just because we stop aid to Ukraine doesn't mean that all these things are going to be addressed. In fact, if we stopped aid tomorrow, none of these things would be addressed. That's the first thing. Second thing, no money for massacres. If we stop sending weapons to Ukraine, why does that necessarily indicate that massacres would stop? There were no Ukrainian soldiers in Kupiansk when they dumped people into mass graves. It was the lack of soldiers in Bakhmut that allowed the Russians to execute people blindly and wildly. It was the lack of soldiers defending Ukrainian orphanages that led to the Russians kidnapping 19.5 thousand Ukrainian children to Russify them, quote unquote, cleanse them of their culture. So when they say no money for massacres, in their mind, it's if you produce a gun, if you make a gun, and this is where the flower child mentality comes around. And I've called them flower children before, and I'm going to call them flower children around. In this mindset, anytime you build a gun, anytime you build a bomb, anytime you build a bullet, anytime you build a weapon of any sort, it is bad because weapons are violence. Anyone with two brain cells to rub together would know that in some instances, you need to defend yourself. We appeased the Russians at every step when it came to the issue of Ukraine. When Russia tried to finagle and strong-arm Ukraine into joining its economic alliance, when it tried to make a deal with the European Union for visa-free travel, we didn't really do anything. We complained, some politicians went there and like yelled a bunch, like John McCain. We didn't send any guns, we didn't send any bombs, we didn't do anything that could give the Ukrainians the power to tell them no outside of our verbal support. When the Ukrainian people protested against the government murdering protesters and tried to outlaw protesting and seceding to the Russian demands that the Russians committed during the Budapest Memorandum that they wouldn't use economic coercion to try to infringe upon Ukrainian territorial sovereignty or infringe upon them in this way. When the protesters came out and finally pushed him out of office and he ran and the Russians illegally invaded, the president, it was basically their president-elect or their interim president came to the United States, asked for support, military support, didn't give them anything. In fact, we didn't give them any lethal military support until 2019, and that was while Russia was flooding the country with tanks, machine guns, bombs, artillery guns, were firing upon convoys in retreat that they were trying to negotiate corridors for. They were participating in battles. We have the evidence, open source intel and otherwise, that they participated in battles that the Russian military itself was fighting, all while they were denying it to both the Ukrainian government and the international community, while we sent the Ukrainians nothing. For years. For years. You look at all of the major battles during the ATO where the Russian-backed forces win, and the Russian army is directly involved in so many of those victories and bringing them to victory. And for example, the Battle of Ilovaisk. This convoy right here, this battle, which was known as the Ilovaisk Massacre, due to how many Ukrainian soldiers got killed when they tried to pull out when they were negotiating a corridor. The Russians denied it, but there's open source intel pinning their columns, their military columns, their tanks that only the Russian army has, tanks that the rebels couldn't have just spawned out of nowhere, weapons that must have come from somewhere. The Russians directly were involved in the battle, and they've been denying it for years. And we let that go on for 8 to 9 years, doing nothing. It was only in 2019 when we finally gave them javelins, which thank God we did because it helped them in the early days, but that's relatively nothing compared to the large-scale military just slush fund that the Russians gave the rebels. This type of behavior went on for so long. At what point, when the Russians again lie about them putting soldiers on the border, and again lie about what was about to happen, literally making up claims of weapons of mass destructions, chemical weapons in Ukraine that need to be seized because they're going to target the DNA of Russian citizens. They invade illegally, commit massacre after massacre after massacre. At one point, do we have to say, the Ukrainians have the right to shoot back? They should shoot back, and they have to push out the occupier, because the occupier does not want to negotiate in good faith. And now, after seeing how many massacres took place, they are not responsible enough to be allowed to occupy the territory. I do not believe that you give territory to a nation that is almost openly, as a government, but has very openly, when it comes to Russian state media, Telegram channels, and think tanks, have described how they're going to go through a process of integration and ethnic cleansing, kicking out the people who identify as Ukrainian, forcing hundreds of thousands of people to millions of people from their homes. And the DSA position is, oh, if we give the guns to the people pushing back against their ethnic cleansing, that is a massacre. No money for massacres. Their analysis stops at bullet kill. So bullet bad. That's where their analysis stops. It's silly. It is silly. The critique against this from a progressive perspective is that this shouldn't be bundled together. Attacking aid to Ukraine as if it's even comparable to aid to Israel or the same moral issue, or any of these are the same moral issue, I can understand that complaint, and I agree with that complaint to a certain extent, even if I understand why the Biden administration is doing it strategically. But attacking aid to Ukraine and treating it like it's like any of these other issues, silly.